All right, hello everybody. System Shock here with this should be part 10 of the Roguelike Dev does the complete roguelike tutorial. And there's a little bit of housekeeping. That's actually, I guess, it's two parts. So you'll notice that Rough is working. And there was actually a little bit of feedback that I got on one of the originally comments on the Reddit post for this series, which I wanted to correct something that I got wrong, and then I'll just excuse me, talk a little bit about some of the changes before moving in. So I was under the impression that the actually, sorry. First of all, I'll just mention that I noticed. It's not the first set of comments that I've gotten. I've actually been very appreciative of the ones that are coming in, but what shows up on YouTube as 4B796C65, which just rolls off the tongue. Thank you very much on the odd chance that you happen to be watching. Thank you very much for the comments. Obviously, doing a YouTube series as sort of a commitment mechanism to just make sure I go through the thing and give the recording. Obviously, I talked in the earlier episodes in terms of why I'm doing this, but it's always a little funny to see the comments, and I'm pleasantly surprised at how sort of positive or sort of learning focused a lot of them have been, because that isn't always what happens on YouTube. Although I think for the most part I've probably been luckier than most. But there is always that kind of moment of self-consciousness. I remember once upon a time I had a blog which was largely personal, and like it wasn't like obviously if you're putting something out publicly, it's not going to be private, and it would be silly to think that it is. But there's obviously the difference between not like there isn't that expectation that people are going to be reading things. And I know that sort of the realizing that there were people who read that and perhaps to my surprise at the time there liked it, which is of course not to imply that people are enjoying this series. But that obviously had sort of a bit of an effect. So the big thing I'm trying to do is continue to try and talk my way through the lessons, because I do find that a useful way to run through. But I'm also slightly conscious of the fact that I'm sure there are probably a few people looking at their monitors screaming at the foolishness going on, to which I can just say, sorry, I'm learning. But in any case, thank you in particular to 4B796C65 for the comments. I feel like I'm sort of under replying. I probably in my own replies, because I already go on too long, really been focused on the more direct or the ones that sort of involve a direct implementation of something. But they're ones that I sort of take on board and I make notes of, just so that I can try and avoid some of the more common stumbles, especially because a couple of them have actually helped with things that I usually stumble over, or I work around in another way, and it's just a little easier to know the reasoning or the logic behind it, and of course also just clearing up misconceptions. So with that in mind, and actually this is kind of funny because I did reply to one wondering how I might get Rough up and running. Rough is working, so I can't even really say what went wrong other than the fact that there seemed to be, and I'm sure I was responsible for this, but it was pointing to some Python interpreter, which I thought it was supposed to be doing anyway. But removing that actually, this is so embarrassing to admit, but on my a project that I've been working on for a while, basically I took a look at this little section here on the right, and it just was pure yellow, and I'm like, it's back. So but on top of that, I did also and again, this is why I started off in terms of the comments, I did also put in MyPy because of the type checking. And I did, so the drawback here, right, is that because I want my focus to really be on the roguelike tutorial, I didn't spend too much time focusing on what I was adding in. So at least the cursory glance said that MyPy would be adding things that Rough didn't have. And likewise, I did also put in black as based on a recommendation. So the plugins are a little bit different from before. So black is here, MyPy. Pylance was already working on here. Jupyter, I mean, this is just not, Jupyter's not relevant, but this is my little Python environment, and then rough. And again, I think probably the consequence is going to be that I'm going to freak out a little bit when I'm told that black is apparently quite opinionated. But to me, this is the thing that I sort of like, especially here, right? So there's maybe not, it's not such a good thing that I'm going to be ignoring the majority of these. But for my own part, I do actually like the extremely long lists in terms of rough, for the simple reason that they often, to me at least, this lets me know some of the stuff that I should be fixing, even if I didn't, even if I didn't know about it. So I think the example that I usually give would be, if I did some sort of print, really common way to debug, I know there's other ways of doing debugging, but I just rely on print a whole lot, or, to give me information in terms of how things ran or something like that. And, rough will say, hey, you should use logging instead of a print. And I was like, oh, I didn't realize logging was an option. And then of course I take a look at logging and I'm like, my God, this is not something I want to do right now. And so it winds up ignored. So again, maybe not so great that I'm going to be ignoring the majority of these, in reality. And as I did say earlier on in the series, it would be nice if you don't get any warnings when you run the program and such. But the big thing right now is that at the very least, the tools that I want are working. And then there's little things here. So trailing comma missing, for instance. I do actually want to go through and maybe fix a lot of these, but I'm not maybe going to do this during one of the roguelike tutorial entries. This is more just sort of for my own understanding. At the very least, I'll try to let this over time guide me in terms of identifying some of the problems and the things that I'm adding, rather than spending the start of this to go through. Maybe after this week's entries or something like that, I might kind of go through this and fix it, or maybe that can be one of the extensions or something like that. But I don't really know if this is going to be all that edifying for people to see me go through, adding doc strings or something like that. So to the final point, which is a rather helpful comment that, who was that? Sorry, let me find this. I thought I had this up, but apparently I didn't. Gazing, I think, said this on Reddit. So they pointed out that they had just finished part 9, but didn't encounter the same problem that I had. So what I had done previously was something like self entity perform, right? So get it to perform the action, or the silly option, which would be to, justify the behavior that was different from what I was expecting with, with text or something like that. But they made, and I seem to recall that I did kind of try and look and see if I'd made a mistake here, but the thing that I hadn't paid attention to, was the return being outside the else. So apparently this is what I had originally, where it should have been this. And as you can see, this is exactly where it is inside of the code here. So that's on me. Obviously, I said that was potentially an error in the tutorial, and obviously that's a fairly big one. I would imagine that is something that people would find at the time. The other ones that I've sort of seen are ones that you can sort of understand not being things that people would would find just because they're in somewhat rare cases, or there's any number of reasons why this stuff wouldn't come up. But this was me making a mistake, and obviously I should own the mistake as opposed to just saying it was the tutorial. So in this case here, it returns the bump action only if it's within this block here. So in this case, we don't need to define direction X and direction Y or elsewhere. I don't actually, off the top of my head, I didn't go too much further inside and say, okay, so how is it that the AI takes its turn after the perform? Maybe it just stays in place, which might be different. Well, I mean, maybe that's fine in terms of what is no longer confused. Obviously, when I talked about it before, I said staying in place probably isn't the action that I wanted. So I think the AI might be behaving a little bit different from what I'd intended at the previous run. But obviously here, this is what the tutorial suggested. And the reason why there was a behavior that was different from what I was expecting was because I didn't tab things properly. So with that confession out of the way, and again, thank you to the folks who are helping me get this thing, get this thing in proper shape. We're going to move on to saving and loading. Maybe I shouldn't close that anyway. Part 10, saving and loading. Saving and loading is essential to almost every roguelike, but it can be a pain to manage if you don't start early. By the end of this chapter, our game will be able to save and load one file to the disk, which you could easily expand to multiple saves if you wanted to. Now, before I go any further, actually, I did do a little bit of reading on this, and I actually thought this was kind of neat. So when you see this claim of saving and loading is essential to almost every roguelike, there is some history on saving and loading in the roguelike, which I wanted to share. Now, again, I think I'm coming at this the wrong way because I've not played Rogue. I think I talked about this before, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But basically, I played, I think it was something like NetHack, and I was like, my God, why does anybody want to play this? I enjoyed Diablo, or one of the Diablo games. I've recently played 4. I haven't finished it, but there's a lot of games that have been inspired by Rogue that I've enjoyed, but as far as a proper roguelike in this style, my only real reaction to it has been this is confusing and difficult. So I'm trying to kind of give myself a little bit of an education. Probably that'll be more after the tutorial. But I talked about one of the local game developers, at least I think I did, who did Into Ruins. So I quite like Eric's games, and I thought Into Ruins was really interesting to look at. And I also tried out Brogue because I think he had mentioned that he was inspired by that for, if not Into Ruins, then something else that he had done. And then I think there's Tales of Magiel or something like that. Anyways, it's one with a billion Steam achievements, it feels like. So that I have picked up. I put a little bit of time into, but not enough to really say that I have a good understanding of it. So yeah, in this case, I've sort of nibbled at it. And obviously there's the things that have been inspired by roguelikes, so Crypt of the Necrodancer and such. But it is always interesting to sort of see where these things come from. And I thought it was kind of neat to go into the history specifically about the save. Because when I read about this, yeah, here we go. The two started testing their... So what kind of got my attention about this is when it said saving and loading is essential to almost every roguelike. And there's actually, again, going from Wikipedia here, there's a little bit of interesting history on that, which is the two started testing the game with other students at UCSC, finding that despite the limited graphics, players were filling the gaps with their own imagination. Playtester feedback allowed them to improve the procedural generation routines to balance the game's challenge. One element that fell out from playtesting was the use of permadeath. Toy wanted to move away from the notion of simply learning the right sequence of steps to complete within adventure games, and instead make the player focus on finding the right moves to avoid the character's death at that moment. Witchman later called this idea consequence persistence. Initially, a rogue game had to be completed in one sitting, but by demand of playtesters, Toy and Witchman added the ability to save the state of the game so that players could continue a game across sessions. They soon found that players were save scumming, reloading the game from the save file, an approach counter to their design goals. They changed this so the save file was erased upon reloading the game, thus making a character's death effectively permanent. They subsequently added a scoreboard feature that let players rank their progress with others, rewarding players with more points for surviving as deep as possible into the dungeons and making the Amulet of Yendor a lucrative goal. So I think this is kind of worth looking into just because, again, when I always find it interesting. Sorry, I'm falling over myself. I always find it interesting when you have sort of claims that say, X is essential to a game. And then ideally what you do is say, but why? And it's not even necessarily to challenge the assumption. Like sometimes it can just be you learn a little bit more about the genre in which you're working, right? So, if you're doing a crime story, sometimes people are expecting the moment when the villain looks to the cop and says, "We're not so different, you and I." And a lot of times that will also just provoke massive eye rolling. But also, I think I've talked about this before, but Old World is an interesting game largely because it deals with sort of asking what is actually essential to the 4X genre, and what do we do because we've sort of always done it, and what is something that we consider to be sort of a major component. Like what would a 4X game look like if we didn't have the benefit of sort of a few decades of civilization? And I think it does quite a good job of it. There's some other things which I sort of struggle to get into, but I think that's a really interesting way of working with it. And I'm pretty sure Soren Johnson has a GDC talk on it, or at the very least, there's like a blog article that he's, or a blog, I guess, that he's written on this, which I thought was kind of interesting. So it's, to me, the reason why this, in addition to just learning a little bit more about this, this genre that has got a subreddit of its own and an annual tradition of making a roguelike, a small roguelike. I think it's a nice little way of kind of moving into this particular part to say that, okay, so saving wasn't originally part of roguelikes. It came as a result of player feedback. And the result of that feedback was actually something counter to what the designers had in mind, and so it needed to be adjusted around. And I think you can learn a little something about that, right? Obviously, the hope would be that we don't, we don't just ape what's come before, that we make our own works, or maybe this is a learning exercise, so there isn't going to be that much in terms of pushing out the frontiers. But the ideal ones are, if you do something new or something that seems new, something that somebody hasn't done before might be the better way of putting it. The ideal situation is that you don't find out that people haven't done that before for good reason. The ideal is that you get to a point where you're trying things that people haven't done before and they delight everyone. And so being able to sort of learn that process of saying that originally Rogue did not have that save, players wanted that save, and then they had to modify the save in order to achieve what they were looking for. You learn a little something about what these games are about. And then, of course, that also provokes a couple of ideas in terms of, well, do I want to change that, right? Do I want to make a roguelike that is expected to be completed in one sitting, right? This actually wouldn't be all that bad today because mobile gaming is such a big thing, right? Mobile games are something that are expected to be done in a very short period of time. But also, I don't think there's a lot of roguelikes for mobile. And would a roguelike work if it were to be in a more condensed package? And then, of course, you would say, all right, so do we still want to jettison this idea of a save or not? Probably you wouldn't, because one of the reasons why mobile games are short is that people have to put their phones away. But again, there's some to me, this is the sort of stuff that's kind of fun to bat around in your head, because clearly what was true at the very beginning isn't necessarily true today, or it might be an area to sort of go back and say, okay, so what if we're on Earth 2 and things had worked out a bit differently. So anyways, hopefully somebody found that as interesting as I did in terms of looking it up. By the end of this chapter, our game will be able to save and load one file to a disk, which you could easily expand to multiple saves if you wanted to. Let's start by defining the colors we'll need for this chapter by opening color.py and entering the following. So after bar empty, menu title. I'm not quite sure why this switches to numbers. Well, they're all number. Why they are not hex. Another thing we'll need is a new type of exception. This will be used when we want to quit the game but not save it. Normally, we'll save the game when the user quits, but if the game is over because the player is dead, we don't want to create a save file. We can put this in exceptions.py. There's a bit of refactoring that we can do to make things easier for ourselves in future. By creating a base class that can either be an action or event handler, we don't need to set the engine's event handler to the new handler when we want to switch. We can just return that event handler instead. A benefit of this is that the engine class won't need to store the event handler anymore. This works by keeping track of the handler in the main.py file instead and switching it when necessary. To make the change, start by adding the following to inputhandlers.py. And I must apologize, the sun just started to hit the window so that it's zapping me in the eye. Okay, so we are adding union, and I think that's it. And then after confirm keys, return value which can trigger an action or switch active handlers. Error is returned, then it will become the active handler for future events. An action is returned, it will be attempted, and if it's valid, then main game event handler will become the active handler. So I'm trying to remember union. Okay, yeah, no, X or Y. So it can be, I think this is the typing again, and it's saying, all right, you can be an action or base event handler. I think this is, if I'm not mistaken, this is basically like optional, except that you're defining something other than none. So I guess, yeah, we could say that this is optional if we somehow could replace none with base event handler. Although we don't have base event handler, so presumably we're adding that next. Class base event handler event dispatch action or handler. Oops. Def handle events, self event, tcod event. No capital on that. So I'm sure you can note, I've been bad at talking, but you can already notice here, right, the sorts of errors that I'm running into are... I'm going to regret saying this later because I'm obviously going to make some mistakes that that I don't catch. But having something like rough, which works very fast and is very... I'm assuming this was rough that did this anyway. But, is right now freaking out about everything. The capitalization, obviously seeing the little freak out there, allowed me to fix that earlier than I probably would. I'm sure I would have sort of noticed it and it would have flagged it. Like Pylance probably would have flagged it or something like that. But it is nice to have a little bit... It's nicer to just sort of catch the error closer to the moment. Just because it's... Well, okay. Sometimes it's nice to actually sort of puzzle something out that's confusing you. But on the other hand, like sometimes just having to kind of go through the code and remember what you did before isn't necessarily that... okay, so I'm trying to remember the book that this was in. It wasn't Rage. It was... Oh, that's a shame. It was a book about learning. I had it recommended to me from the book Range, and I'm actually rather annoyed with myself for not remembering it. I apologize. But anyways, it was definitely it made quite a convincing case in terms of how struggling with a problem was a way in which sort of more that stronger learning would take place. It's not a silver bullet, right? It's not. This is not another version of the 10,000 hours nonsense that people go on about, but it needs to be something that you can actually sort of comprehend and understand. So if I sit down with a medical textbook and I try to solve all the problems in the last chapter, I will spend time struggling with that, and I'm not necessarily going to understand. But if it's something that you have a realistic chance of being able to understand, even if you don't get the answer and you're able to later get that kind of correction, which obviously is something that's kind of nice about the people here sort of saying, hey, tab in the return, and that should be fine. Taking the time to solve the thing is actually a method through which you get better. But with that in mind, not every problem merits that. So in this case here, little simple typos, it's nice to be able to catch those sooner. So being able to realize, oh, hey, this is probably a problem I wouldn't have noticed until I got to the end of the definition or the method, would want to give credit where it's due. Okay. So let me just, recap we've got here. Okay, so we've got, we're dispatching an event. If it's an instant of a base event handler, we return the state. If it's not an instance of an action, so we haven't quite gotten there yet, so... I haven't seen self !R before. Cannot handle actions. Okay, if you can just give me a second here. I'm sorry, I'm looking in the wrong browser. This is all just silent reading in front of all of you. Let's take a second here. All right, so guess I should have used Brave's superior search rather than Google. Sure. I should know what this is, but I don't offhand, but I guess I could have could have typed it in here and just moused over. Canonical string represent. Oh, okay, gotcha. And then for many object types, this equals the object itself. I learned something new about f-strings. Okay, so basically it's saying I can't handle an action if it doesn't work. This, I think, throws an exception. And apparently it doesn't like... I think normally it should... where was it? This is going to take... Oops. It's going to take some getting used to. You know what? I won't worry about this right now, but I would like to actually sit down and find out why it thinks... wait, Alt F8. Assertions are removed when Python is run with optimization requested, which is a common practice in production environments. As such, assertions should not be used for runtime validation or user input to enforce interface constraints. So yeah, these are, I mean, so again, what I've done here is I've put, this is why I don't want to go through all of these, because for me, the overzealous rough is nice to teach me conventions like that, and the hope is that I will eventually decide which ones I think are important and which ones I'm willing to do without. But it does sort of slow down these in the sense of, you know, the tutorial is fine with this, and I should be too. All right, let's move on because I've taken too long on something that should be quite simple. Okay, def on render. Okay. So presumably the event handler will now inherit from base event handler. As the docstring explains, action or handler can be either an action or an event handler. If it's an action, the action will be attempted, and if it's a handler, the handler will be changed. Base event handler will be the base class for all our handlers. We'll change that to be the case next. If it will return a new instance of base event handler or its subclasses if one was returned, or return itself. This allows us to change event handlers based on the context of what happens in the actions. We also need to adjust event handler. So base event handler. And sorry, handle events is much bigger now. Right, because yeah. Events for input handlers with an engine. It's also changed. So we've still got self event tcod event, but it now returns a base event handler. Action or state. Okay, so if it's a base event handler, return the result of this. Okay, so if we're working with a base event handler, it returns, so it just returns the result of dispatch. No, it should be action or state. So we know we don't have a base event handler. Let action was performed. If not, self engine player is alive. Player was killed sometime during or after the action. Turn game over event handler. Okay, does this make sense? Basically, behave the old, was it? Yeah. No, because it's not handle action. Okay, no, this makes sense. And then we removing EV quit because that is in the old. Or that's in the base. Okay, the handle events method of event handler is similar to base event handler, except it includes logic to handle actions as well. It also contains the logic for changing our handler to a game over if the player is dead. To adjust our existing handlers, we'll need to continue editing input handlers. Okay, actually, so there's one thing which doesn't. This is again one of these cases where, you know, you hear people say things, and they can wind up being something that sort of hurts you later because you don't quite understand where they come from. But there's the idea that's been communicated to me before. I think this might come from, I've not really read that. I think I've read like the first part of Clean Code, but apparently there's like a series of books from someone known as Uncle Bob. And I don't know if it comes from this or it just happens to be something that represents it very well. And again, this is not a statement on the value of these books. It's one that I've heard. It's one that clearly comes up a whole lot. But there seems to be this idea of like everything should be doing one thing. And so once you start adding, this or this, that is sort of an indication that you're going down the wrong path. Now, the thing that I feel a little uncomfortable with mentioning that is that I know the best example I can put. This is like an example that's not going to make sense to anybody but me, but it's the only analogy that comes to mind. Is it's a little bit like doing econometrics out of a textbook as opposed to a workplace, because everybody does econometrics in their workplace, right? But like this idea that when you do something in a classroom setting, you have this very tidy data set, and there's you kind of know that you're going to get to some sort of a result, or if you're doing like a math problem. Chances are, like if you're in a calculus class, there's a good signal that you've probably gone wrong if you're doing a textbook problem and it involves this like massive ugly result with a whole bunch of like little parts, and just usually the answers tend to be these things that have these nice sort of tidy ends. And of course, real world problems can sometimes look very ugly. And if you're doing econometrics in the real world, number one, the result you're looking for may not be there, or you may not have the data that's able to do that. And I have to imagine that there is probably a programming equivalent to this where it's very easy to write in a book that, every function, every method should just do one thing. And then you have the real world situation which says, okay, yeah, but, and then, there's a bunch of very reasonable real world examples of that. So this is why I feel a little, iffy on this idea of like action or base event handler. Because it's just one of these things where, because of this one book, or not even book, with this one part from a book that people seem to quote comes up, and it kind of sort of pings in the back of my head. And obviously this isn't a function. But what I don't know, maybe I have it through a subscription service that I'm part of, so maybe I should sit down and see the reasoning behind it. But that's one thing that came to mind when I was thinking about that. And we'll see, maybe hopefully by the end I'll be able to answer for myself why either that isn't good advice, or it seems like good advice, right? You don't need to keep in track as many things when you're debugging. But hopefully by the end of this, I'll be able to explain, why this is the best way to do it. Okay. To adjust our existing handlers, we'll need to continue editing input handlers. This next code section is quite long, but the idea is consistent throughout. We want to modify our return types to return optional action or handler instead of optional action. And instead of setting self engine event handler to change the handler, we'll return the handler instead. So this is actually kind of funny here. So I did kind of this was an analogy that didn't really need to be made, right? The union of action base event handler. I say it's like, oh, so it's like an optional, but you're replacing the none with base event handler. Well, now we're adding the none back. So actually, I wonder if this would be equivalent to this. Not that I'm going to write, that would not be the same, but this idea of option, action, or handler, I'm curious if we were to unpack this, if this would just be the same as union action-based event handler or none. Anyways, let's get the work done. So ask user event handler. So apparently we just get rid of this entirely. And that is because we already have it in event handler, I guess. For key down, we are changing the optional. Okay, and button down, presumably the same here. And then okay, these are the same. On exit, we have a bit more to change. I'm actually slightly curious about this. So main game event handler. Okay, guess I need to go back up to event handler. Okay. What I'm trying to get a read on here is that it says return none. I'm almost wondering here, like obviously we need to change the optional. I'm actually wondering if this, oh no, hang on. Yeah, because of the dot event handler. Never mind. Sorry, I'm being foolish. Okay, now I've gone and done it. Ask user event handler. I must apologize. I realize this yellow text must be very, very frustrating to look at. I will see maybe if between episodes I'll maybe work on these. Now this is interesting. So it doesn't like... Really? Use X or Y annotations. Why don't you like that? More concise and readable than the previous typing union typing optional syntaxes. Okay, fair enough. I suppose this also explains, so I wonder if I were to take a look at the, yeah. So I have a sneaking suspicion that this is actually what the library, I think the library is updated to this, which is why when I was importing everything. So remember how like it was auto-completing in the previous videos and it would give those, it would give the more concise format as the rule said. I suspect that probably what I was doing was sort of quote unquote correcting it to the old way. But again, I'm going to follow the tutorial here and then I can adjust back after the fact. Okay, inventory handler. So actioner handler. Oh, on key down. This, of course, is going to be rather tedious because I'm not entirely sure, for video purposes, I mean, I'm not entirely sure there's a whole lot that we learn doing the same thing over and over again. Although I learned, at least in terms of the little rules that it's telling me here, I'm finding it instructive. Okay, action or handler. Select index handler is getting key down. Mouse button down. I think, yeah, well, they just broke it up over a couple lines, so. On index selection again, or handler. Look handler is and we're changing. Right, this is like the previous. Okay, now on to main game event handler. So first of all, we're returning the OR handler. And then here it says history viewer. Same story. So seeing the returns sort of, it's the difference between reading the instructions and doing it, like actually being confronted with these returns and saying, like, okay, I get an idea. I think one of the things I have noticed through the tutorial is that there will be some points where it's like, okay, I understand a bunch of computery words that were just put on the screen, and I will do this, and the program will not yell at me for doing this. But what I do tend to notice in cases like this, I'll sometimes sort of walk through the fog without really, like if somebody were to stop me, let's say it's like in a classroom setting or something like that, and there's a TA to stop and say, okay, why did you just do that step right now? I would so obviously be making it up as I go along. Like I'd be trying to say something to make them happy. And what I tend to notice is that I get out of that state when we start having sort of user interface stuff. So I hit the I button, and now we're returning the inventory activate handler rather than changing engine.event handler to inventory activate handler. So is that good? Should I know it a little bit earlier? I don't know. I just think it's probably, I think it's natural to sort of think in ways of saying like, I do this thing and the computer does this in response, which is why sometimes building up towards those steps are ones where I'm sort of like, I think I know where we're going with this, but I might need a little bit more. Okay, the game over event handler. I'm just trying to think. So it's yelling. Oh, right. It's yelling about the or why. So this is one question that I should have for myself. So why is it that we just do optional action? Well, why would we return a handler if we're in the game over? Yeah. Okay. Oh, hang on. I think I missed one history viewer. Okay, so out of all these cases, if they haven't happened, then we don't do anything. I do sometimes wonder what the difference is between... Actually, this would be a good thing for me to look up. So if I got rid of this, I was sort of under the impression that this would probably be returning none anyway. Although this is interesting. Missing an explicit return at the end of a function. Okay, yeah, well, that answers that. It wants me to be explicit. We'll also need to make a few adjustments in consumable.py because some of the methods there also affected the input handlers. Okay, so consumable.py. Oops, add some components. Okay, from input handlers, area ranged attack handler. So what does it say here? Unsorted and unformatted. Okay, on to consumable. We do get action. Get action is the, sorry, we just did get action. Confusion consumable. Presumably the same. Oh. Okay, so we add the message, get a location. And then, yeah, we can just return. Yeah, so this already returns what we need, so we don't need to explicitly return none. Fireball damage, we need to do the same thing. I mean, effectively, it kind of behaves like the confusion, except you, like the fact that it takes care of a region doesn't really alter the types. Although I'm perhaps surprised area range attack. Actually, okay, I'm surprised that it's not the same, but I shouldn't have been surprised that it's area ranged attack handler, and we'll change the return, change this to return presumably. Yep. Okay. Sorry, I realize at this point I'm just doing an audiobook of the code changes here, but this is all sort of reformatting. I don't have as much to add. We also need to make a small adjustment to fighter.py. So we get rid of the game over handler. And when the player dies, we get rid of that. Since logic associated with setting game over event handler is now handled in the event handler class, this line in fighter.py wasn't needed anymore. In order to make these changes work, we'll need to adjust the way that the input handlers are, well, handled. What we'll want to do is have the event handler exist in on its own in main.py rather than be part of the engine class. Open up main.py, which should already be open, and make the following changes. So after entity factories, we're going to import exceptions and import input handlers. And then after the log, hello adventurer and welcome to yet another dungeon. Here are your handlers. Okay, so under new terminal, okay, so while true, we are still clearing the console. On render, nope. Okay, context present. This should still be the same. Context convert event should still be the same. So this just needs to be a handler now. Oh, but we need to do handler equals. Okay, so we've got an exception, traceback, print the error to the message log. All right, so we're changing this. Okay, oh, that makes sense. Okay, and then new exceptions. I forgot to add the try, didn't I? No, that's here. But my old friend, the wrong tab. So it's right, okay. It was a little weird to me that the while true was deleted, but I see now. Okay, so nope, that's the wrong one. Root console. Okay, order F, try. All this gets tabbed in. Ah. Okay, again, probably took me longer to get through that than it should have, but I sort of see what's going on here, right? We added the try on the outside so that we can have all of these events. Basically, when the game stops for whatever reason, we want to know whether or not we're handling. I think this is kind of the catch to make sure that we don't save unintentionally. And then these are basically saying even if there's an error of some kind, you know, the player is not going to lose their progress. This actually reminds me, I'm sorry to do all the digressions on all that, but I had this really funny experience watching a Twitch streamer, and this is kind of a mean story about them, so I'm not going to like say who the name is, but like they kind of fancy themselves a really like skilled gamer, but they also have a tendency to get quite upset at games that don't let them win, right? So there's a sort of person who like, you know, will do a lot of the get good when talking about Dark Souls, but will also get like mad at Dark Souls and, you know, I'll frequently talk about how games are unbalanced or unfair or something like that. And I thought it was really funny because they, for a really long time, kept coming into my channel when I was playing Darkest Dungeon. And this is after on their own channel when they were talking about how the game quote unquote cheats. And what they had specifically said was, you know, 15% probability or whatever, like low probability event was supposed to happen, like doesn't happen. That happens all the time. I experimented and saw that this happened. So I'm like, okay, so I, you know, after I was pretty sure from the first time I knew how to translate that sentence, but I didn't want to say anything until sort of this is, I think, the third or fourth time that they were coming in. And like, it wasn't, obviously people can have their own opinions about games. That's not the problem here. But this idea that kind of coming in while I'm playing a game that I'm enjoying and really trying to convince me that the game that I'm playing and enjoying is a game that I don't actually enjoy, got to be a bit much. So basically, I kind of, this is more sort of through the Socratic method, let's say, ask a few questions about it. And this more or less confirmed my suspicion here that basically what he did was, because he lost a character he really wanted, and obviously that's a big moment in Darkest Dungeon and XCOM and stuff like that, and it like, it doesn't feel good, but obviously the lows and the highs, like, Darkest Dungeon, except, I guess, unless you're playing on Stygian mode, like, the actual loss of a character really isn't, that's not permanently going to set you back. The worst that happens is that you lose time, basically. You have to spend the time leveling up the valuable people. And the thing is that I think it's completely reasonable for people to say, like, I like this game, but I don't like this leveling the character up to what I had before enough. And, there's certainly a number of people who really enjoy Darkest Dungeon, didn't necessarily complete Darkest Dungeon, but would potentially enjoy Darkest Dungeon too. So in any case, so yeah, completely understandable reaction. But Mr. Get Good here was crashing out the game when they lost a character that they had. And then they would go to this event, which to their mind is a low probability event, right? It's 15%. It can't happen every single time. And of course, what are they doing? They're seeing the exact same result over and over again. So hopefully it's clear here that I'm not just randomly coming up with this story. Like, this is sort of dealing with the different states of the save. So again, like, this was my suspicion, and eventually they sort of confirmed, not in so many words, but like, it's pretty clear that this is what's happened. And so when I finally had enough, I kind of had to let them know what I actually thought. And I basically explained that, there is such a thing as seeded RNG, and that basically from the beginning of that playthrough, that outcome was foreordained. And that if you want to make sort of so obviously it's the gambler's fallacy if you assume that, the probability for that 15% event is anything but 15%, right? The fact that there had been, 8 successes prior has no bearing whatsoever on what the next round is going to be. But that's not even really relevant here. The idea here is that 15% is a statement. I'm just pulling 15 out of thin air, by the way. But, across all sessions of Darkest Dungeon, that would be a 15% event. But once you are locked into that series of random numbers, that is going to be at that time what happens. And then, of course, now we move the goalposts, right? Well, that's just stupid. They shouldn't have done it that way. I said, it's like, well, the game did say from the beginning that it was punishing and that, when your characters die, they stay dead, right? It seems like they are fulfilling the contract. The fact that they are, generating the random numbers at the beginning, where you thought that they were being generated at the time, that doesn't really seem to me to be a violation of what you signed up for on it, right? I'm not saying you can't be upset about it. I think the game makes it so that you should be upset about it. But again, when you get your pride on being TM good at video games, I hear you get to keep the gold at the end of Darkest Dungeon. I think that's why I was upset. But anyways, a nice little reminder for me in terms of why saving at certain points matter, right? Maybe you don't want to save when somebody is expecting no save, but it's rather important to save at these moments here. I don't know if that was a useful story or not, but for me, I like being able to relate this to experiences that players have. Also, I just thought that guy was a bit of a jerk, and it's actually very funny, to my head at least, that their quote-unquote experimentation was not not actually living up to the standards of Get Good. What can I say? I am an unkind person. Okay, we are now defining our handler in main.py rather than passing it to engine. The handler can change if a different handler is returned from handler.handle events. We've also added a few exception statements for the various exception types. They'll all do the same thing at the moment, but soon, once we've implemented our save function, the system exit and base exception exceptions will save the game before exiting. Quit without saving will not, as this will be called when we don't want to save the game. If you run the project now, things should work the same as before. Well, let's make sure I didn't blow anything up. Looks good. I don't want to spend too much time playing, but let's see if I can get through to the end. We can take them. One thing I will say, so when I look at under just the list of things that I might change, when I take a look at the list, when I say, okay, here's my 2 healing potions, let's say, it's A and D. I'm not crazy about the fact that the button for the healing potion changes. And I'm actually not quite sure how I would go about changing that. Because the inventory is not a fixed thing. Okay. You again. Oops. So as an example, I pushed C instead of... Not another troll. Cool. So I mean, as far as so this is one thing that's kind of worth talking about, right? Previously, I'd talked a little bit about the different balances, and I was like, okay, so what would I expect on average in terms of an enemy to be taken out? I didn't necessarily play optimally. A lot of cases with 2 orcs, both taking swings at me and so on and so forth, not using confusion spells when I could, but definitely a couple of points where my health was near the bottom. And then also, but by the end of this level here, right, I'm at 21 of 30. I'm up a confusion scroll. So if I was going to the next part of the dungeon, right now we don't have anything along the lines of equipment or any kind of loot or something like that. But in this case here, right, this seems roughly like what I would maybe expect inside of a game. I'm down 9 health points. I'm up an item. I've kind of got the lessons like, okay, if the levels are going to start getting harder, I'm going to need to smarten up in terms of my play. It's probably the big lesson I would take away from that. But we didn't get any warnings. We didn't get any errors. So, well, sorry, we have warnings, 178 of them, but I'm ignoring them. I will not ignore them forever, by the way, but for the purposes of this section, I am. Let's clean up the engine class by removing the event handler attribute as we don't need it anymore. Okay, import annotations, type checking, don't worry about any of that. From input handlers, we remove the main game handler. We'll get that out of type checking. And presumably we just look for the red lines. I think that's just... Okay, you don't like... Instead of try, except... Again, I want to read these to see what the complaint's about. If you run the project again, nothing should change. The event handler in engine was not doing anything at that point. I'm not going to do a full, not going to do a full run of it, but try and bang into some walls. Pick up an item. We'll do maybe one more room. Cool. Before we implement saving the game, we need to implement a main menu where the user can choose to start the game or load an existing one or simply quit. It would also be handy to move all the logic of setting up the game into a function, so we don't need to call it when we eventually get to loading a game from a save file. Create a new file called setupgame.py and put the following contents into it. This is kind of like those, I think it's C. Anyways, it's one of these videos where they're like, how long does it take you to write C code until you have, some kind of, God, was it, it's not error. It's like some safety violation or something like that. So already, okay, imported but unused is forgivable there. Import tcod, import color. I think I could tab complete that. Now, I don't think we got that, did we? We had tiles. Presumably, we will have to download that at some point. Or make it. Find new game. Returns an engine. Turn a brand new game session as an engine instance. Map width 80. Map height 3. Room max size 10. Room min size equals 6. Max rooms 30. Max monsters per room 2. I think this is all the same from before, but I think it's still worth doing the work. Player copy deep copy. We talked about deep copy before, so player engine player. Well, presumably all of this we would have talked about before if I had if this is just the same code as before. Generate dungeon. Oops. Okay, sorry. Engine game map. We're good there. Update field of view for the first time. Engine message log. Add the message. Hello and welcome, adventurer, to yet another dungeon. Now this should be new. And I guess we would need to, presumably we're going to add some sort of like menu handler to handle the different directions and instructions. Wasn't there a thing about... Oh, wait, no, there's a comment as well about the double slash. Like making sure it was an integer. For width... I don't think it's worth meditating on too much. Ooh, we've got a name now. I did actually have an extension idea a little while back. Again, I'm trying to hold off on the extent. Obviously, I sort of riff off some ideas already. Oops. But yeah, I'm trying not to... It's all right, we're following it to the letter. But yeah, so obviously there's ideas that come up. I actually think that's not a bad way of sort of seeing what interests you and what would be worth doing. But again, it's sort of that idea of like, okay, you know, it's easy to come up with ideas. How many of those ideas, particularly by the end, when you sort of have this window for when you're going to sort of show off the finished version of your game, etc., what realistically do you think you're going to be able to do, as opposed to stuff that might be fun? There's, in fact, I know, like, from conversations with people, there's no end of like very fun or funny ideas. But it's sort of like, if you were to put, you know, the best example I could give, if there was like such a thing as like a meme in, well, presumably there's something like a meme in the 1970s, but like we wouldn't have called it that. But like, you know, Dr. Livesey and the Funk Walk, right? Whatever version of that would be there. And if that was in like Rogue, I'm sure that would be hilarious for everyone involved. And of course, at this point, you know, at best it's confusing, and at worst it's just sort of this very, that didn't age very well kind of humor. So there's that tension, right, in terms of things that seem kind of fun on their own or at the time, but are these the sorts of things that you actually want to spend the time implementing? And are these things that are consistent with sort of the long-term enjoyment, long-term benefit of the game? Then again, right, not everything has to be sort of a perfectly wrought you know, masterpiece that lives. This is a tutorial after all, right? But I'm sure there's a lot of really good opinion pieces that were written, in the 18th and 19th century, which are not necessarily important literary artifacts today, just simply because they were about contemporary issues that have since been resolved. Doesn't mean they weren't well written, doesn't mean they're not of interest to historians, but they didn't need to be something that lasted like Gulliver's Travels or something. Anyways, but yeah, with that in mind, I did have a couple of ideas based on specifically how I've been doing this tutorial. But I'm kind of sitting on them just because I would like to, I'd like to see, like, scoping is one of these things I think would be important to learn. And I think that would be good to do once the tutorial is done, as opposed to just running off and chasing whatever idea comes into my head while I'm doing this. Okay. Menu width 24 for I text enumerate. Okay. So this seems to make sense to me because we're moving these down by 2 each time we print out a menu item. Text just, or sorry, no, we're doing it by 1. So we've got height, floor division 2 minus 2 plus 1. So it would be minus 2 for the first, minus 3 for the second, minus 4 for the fourth. So we wouldn't be a chain. It would be if it was multiplied by 2. I'm just going to assume 64 is the appropriate alpha value. All right, the key down. Okay, so we don't need a handler for this. Yes, keysim. Why do I even have tab complete? Elif event sim. This presumably is one of these cases where we might have gotten away with the matches, but again, I'm just going to follow what the tutorial suggests here. Okay, and then because, oh, then we need to return none. Oops. Unnecessary else if after a raise. So I'm curious why it's warning that, warning for that, because presumably this does not account for all cases. But I'm just going to double check here. So when we do new game from main game, main game event handler. Yeah, we generate the new game. We return an engine to main game event handler. Let's break this code down a bit. Background image tcodimage.load menu background.png. This line loads the image file that we will use for our background in the main menu. If you haven't already, be sure to download that file. You can find it here. Download by right-clicking and saving it from here. I think that's supposed to be an HTML file. This is just explaining this, right? I don't think there's anything new on here. I'm just going to double check though. Okay, engine 804310. Yeah, so I think this is just the explainer. This should all look very familiar. It's the same code we use to initialize our engine in main.py. We initialize the same things here, but return an engine so that main.py can make use of it. This will help reduce the amount of code in main.py while also making sure that we won't waste time initializing the engine class if we're loading from a save file. On to the main menu. It might seem strange to put an event handler here rather than in its normal spot in event input handlers.py. So oddly enough, we did actually put an event handler in. We just didn't have it from input handlers, and it will explain why. But this makes sense for two reasons. One, the main menu is specific to the start of the game. Two, it won't be called during the normal course of the game like other input handlers in that file. Anyway, the class renders the image that we specified earlier, and it displays a title, Tombs of the Ancient Kings. Of course, you can change this to whatever name you have in mind for your game. It also includes a By Your Name Here section, so be sure to fill your name and let everyone know who it was who worked so hard to make this game. Well, I suppose that would be the tutorial authors and the kind people on Reddit and the YouTube comments who have been dragging me over the finish line here. So if you would like to have your name credited, just let me know what to put inside there. The menu also gives three choices: new game, continue last game, and quit. The EV keydown method, as you might expect, handles these inputs. If the player presses Q, the game just exit. If the player presses N, a new game starts. We do this by returning the main game event handler and calling the new game function to create our new engine. If the player presses C, theoretically a saved game should load. However, we haven't got there yet as of now, so nothing happens. Now, this is not even a nitpick. This is just something that I'm keeping in the back of my head. Technically, the buttons that we have here don't really connect to the letters that we have in place. So if for whatever reason we changed, I mean, I suppose one way of thinking of it would be if we do some kind of localization maybe, but then again, like, we can change this string and move these on. So that's not a good excuse. I suppose there's a case to be made that you may want to do something to link the instructions on the screen to the buttons that will actually be pressed. But on the other hand, right, we do have escape, so we don't just do Q, we do escape you know, there's like, again, I think this makes perfect sense, but I suppose one thing that might trip me up later is if I do something to, you know, add more in the menu or something along those lines. It's, again, not something, I wouldn't even consider this for an extension, but that was something that kind of came to mind. Let's utilize our main menu function in main.py like this. So we don't need copy anymore. We don't need engine and factories. We're not making a dungeon in here, but we are setting up a game. All right. You're out. Nope. Still keep the screen, we just don't keep the map. Keep the tile set and lose basically everything but the handler. And then we change this to be... Right, so this is, we're going to the main menu every time we open the game. We're removing the code that dealt with setting up the engine, as that's been moved into the new game function. All we have to do here is set our handler to main menu, and the main menu class handles the rest from there. Run the game now, and you should see the main menu. Shameful. All right, typo time. I also want to double check that there's a comma at the end of that. I think there would be. Yep. No music? So if we... Okay, so Q doesn't do... Oh, we got a few things here. Quite a few things here, actually. So future warning, soon to the tcod module will no longer hold constants directly. Add from tcod import libtcod pi if you haven't already. Okay, let's do this. Okay, so in setup game, okay. Actually, oh, now I've gone and done it. I'm going to just let that be. What else don't you like? All right. Okay, so the key downs don't work because they're in on render. And I should have known that because of the darkened EV key down. But I was wondering if that was related to not finishing those other things, and I didn't check before. So, but the good news is we did get the warnings handled. So let's try that again. Okay, no more warnings. Escape quits. Q quits. C doesn't do anything. I'm not going to do the full run, but we will do a couple of rooms. You'll never take me alive. Cool. No warnings. Note, if you run the project and get this error, process finished with exit code 139 interrupted by signal 11, it means you didn't download the menu image file. At last, we've come to the part where we will write the function that will save our game. This will be a method in Engine, and we will write it like this. Or LZMA. I think that's compression. Now, I'd heard you're not supposed to use pickle because it's not safe or something like that, but I don't know. It is an option. I guess it's like don't get like mysterious pickle files from other. Presumably, if some adversary is going to try and do terrible things to my computer, they are not going to. They're not going to go into my, my whatchamacallit, tutorial, roguelike tutorial and mess around with the saves. Again, this is that's not an actual comment on the tutorial. That's more just me recognizing the fact that you can like hear something at one point and all of a sudden it becomes a silly rule. When of course these things are designed for, perfectly reasonable. They're there for a reason. So, anyways, I guess we're adding this to the bottom. File name is a string. Don't return anything. Save this engine instance as a compressed file. So, looking like my assumption about the first import was right. So save data. So I may compress pickle dumps self. Open file name. So my understanding here, the convention of with open as f is basically if you if something gets in the way, this just closes everything. It leaves nicely, and if you just try to manually do everything yourself, it will potentially cause problems if the program crashes. I think that's generally why that's done. I've never questioned it, just it's one of these things that I've sort of done without questioning it because it seems to make sense, and more importantly, it means I need to type less. Pickle dump serializes an object hierarchy in Python. LZMA compresses the data so it takes up less space. We then use with open file name WB, so that's write as binary, I believe, as f to write the file W. Oh yeah, it says here write in binary mode, calling f write save data to write the data. It might be hard to believe, but this is all we need to save our game because all of the things we need to save exist in the engine class. We can pickle it and we're done. Of course, it's not quite that simple. We still need to call this method and handle a few edge cases, like when the user tries to load a save file that doesn't exist. To save our game, we'll call save as from our main.py function. We'll set up another function called save game to call it like this. So after input handler, instead of main. Okay, so this kind of interests me here. If it's event handler, save it, but don't do anything else. I was thinking that there might be some kind of a warning that there wasn't a save, but we'll see where this goes. Okay, so on system exit, we save. Game handler. Now when you exit the game, you should see a new savegame.sav in your project directory. One thing that would help handle the case where the user tries to load a saved file when one doesn't exist would be a pop-up message. Well, let's just see what happens with this save file. Okay, so if I quit, so start a new game. Oops. Okay, so there's the save. Now this, what I should be doing before I commit, I should be changing the getIgnore to get rid of the saves as well. I don't see a point on bringing those up. Does it overwrite it automatically? I guess I don't have a... Do I have file information on that? Okay, 1845. Modify, okay, fair. Add this class to input handler. Now I know I closed one of these, so I may need to, yeah, looks like it was input handler. Or I guess I could have seen that from here. Okay, display, pop-up text window. Def init self parent handler is the base event handler. Text is a string. Parent handler self text is text. Def on render self console tcod console none. Render the parent and dim the result, then print the message on top. Foreground. Okay, divided by 8. I'm trying to remember. I think there was going to be, I think it's going to ask for something different for tiles RGB. I don't remember offhand though, so I'll let the warning pop up and we'll deal with it at the time. Right. And then a key down. Oop. Whoa. What happened here? Kind of want to know what button I pressed, but anyways. Obviously, I defer to the Simpsons for the any key joke. And that should have been between base and event handler. This displays a message on top of the current display, whether it's the main menu or the main game. When the player presses a key, any key, the message disappears. Now let's shift our focus to loading the game. We can add a load game function in our setupgame.py file, which will attempt to load the game. We'll call it when we press the C key on the main menu. Open up setupgame.py and edit it like this. There we go. Okay, so we need to get the file out. We need to read the pickle. Same problem as last time. There we go. An engine stems from a file with open file name. So RB. Obviously, if we had the B before, we have to have the B after as F engine pickle loads LZ decompress F read. Assert is instance engine. If it's not, we're in trouble. Okay, and we get rid of the to do. Try. Sorry, I probably should be reading this out. But yeah, so we've got, first of all, we try to load the game. If we fail to load the game, there's a few things that can happen. First of all, there's a file not found error, in which case we just inform our player that there is no saved game to load. Line's too long. If we get any other kind of exception, we print the traceback. And we give a pop-up message which says failed to load the save, and then produces the text of the exception. Load game essentially works the opposite of save as by opening up the file, uncompressing and unpickling it, and returning the instance of the engine class. It then passes that engine to main game event handler. If no save game exists or an error occurred, we display a pop-up message. And with that change, we can load our game. Try exiting your game and loading it afterwards. The implementation as it exists now does have one major... Well, let's do the action first. All right. So what did I screw up? Invalid syntax in line 1. What did I just do? That's more like it. I was already in a Python environment. Okay. Okay. Loaded fine. Because I'm feeling impish. Failed to load the save input format not supported by the decoder. Cool. Oh, and there's my, yep, this is exactly what I was looking for. So on key down. So I gotta keep in mind here, right? So this is an error that we were expecting, so I don't want to freak out about that too much. Yep, so this is exactly what should be happening, but this attribute has been renamed to RGB. This is the error I was looking for before. $100. I'm going to do that one more time. Okay. Let's just make sure the error is limited. So input format not supported, fine. All fine here. We're not getting the RGB warnings. Okay, and let's kill this thing. I guess we could just load over it, but actually, hang on. Good. The implementation as it exists now does have one major issue, though. The player can load their save file after dying, and doing so actually allows the player to take an extra turn. The player can't continue the game after that, though, as our game immediately after detects that the player is dead, and the game state reverts to a game over. Still, this is an odd little bug that can be fixed quite simply by deleting the save game file after the player dies. To do that, we can override the EV quit method in Game Over Event Handler, open up input handlers, and make the following fix. Okay. Port OS. I'm sure there's a way of getting like a list of the different functions so I don't need to search like this, but at the very least I could do a find. But right, so game over event handler, we've got the key down. Okay, so def on quit, self none, handle exiting out of a finished game. So I like this phrasing, right? Because there's also, while we haven't yet implemented victory, this implies victory, and that we would be able to do the same thing with a when we win. Congratulations, we're deleting your save. And quit. Okay, let me just think over this. Okay, yes, because it's a game over event handler, there isn't a situation under which we would want to would want to keep this save. So on quit, ev quit, self on quit, and then instead of system exit, we're now going to go to self on quit. Wait a minute. Right, no, because the exception is how we do the exit. Okay. We use the OS module to find the save file, and if it exists, we remove it. We then raise quit without saving so that the game won't be saved on exiting. Now when the player meets his or her tragic end, it's a roguelike, it's inevitable, the save file will be deleted. The last thing before we wrap up, we're creating the .save files to represent our saved games, but we don't want to include these in our Git repository since that should be reserved just for the code. The fix for this is added to our .git ignore file. So I'm glad I didn't jump the gun on that. This clearly was designed. I think I put this in by default from GitHub. There is absolutely no way I was the one who put all this in. The rest of git ignore is omitted as your git ignore may look different from mine. It doesn't matter where you add this in. Yeah, no, it definitely looks different. Okay, I don't really think we need to test. We will, just because, you know, this is what we've done each time, but I think we're at a point where I can commit this and call it a day. Okay, play a new game. So one thing that's a little not ideal, let's say, right now, because clearing a floor just gives us an empty level and we don't have like starvation or something like that. Technically, you can load into a map with nothing else to do. But I mean, this is driven by the player. If you want to be bored, you're welcome to. Yeah, I don't think there would be any real value in saying, like, checking to see if there's no monsters or items on the of your lives. Okay, I think we only have a couple more rooms at the bottom here. Only one more room. Cool. Would actually be kind of nice. Again, this maybe would be better for an extension, but I suppose for the purposes of testing, like it's kind of, I think it's kind of nice to just play through at the very least at the end. Also, I forgot another room. I think it would be kind of nice to have something to sort of save the state I'm in at the end of each little run. Like I think it would be kind of nice to have a bit of data in terms of what a casual run through each floor looks like. We haven't really been changing any of the enemy behaviors, but I don't know. Again, this is my inclination to be a little more data obsessed, but it'd be sort of interesting to just sort of see, you know, at the end of one of these runs, what was the result for me? What does that look like? Presumably once you go from, or once you would start, you know, having other people play it, it would be sort of nice to see what the difference between you and a seasoned veteran might be. There's not a whole lot here, so I imagine there wouldn't be too much variation. What you'd probably be measuring is how committed people were to optimally completing the dungeon. But again, that would be something to do in the extensions. So honestly, there isn't that much in terms of questions for the tutorials. I do feel bad that this is kind of 2 hours, and I think in this one in particular, it was a lot of just very rote sort of following of the tutorial. But on the other hand, like there isn't, so the saving side of things, as the tutorial points out, this is not that complicated, right? You're using pickle. You don't even really need to use the compress. It's just nice to do, and it's not like it doesn't take a whole lot. So, you know, the actual save is not that hard. It's really it's kind of all adding all the stuff around it. And this is, I think, valuable because in the end, the interface stuff is what the player cares about. You know, I don't think they're going to express strong opinions on what compression you are using, but they are definitely going to be upset if you can't load or save the game, or if it's, you know, saved in such a way that there's a probability that it gets corrupted or something along those lines. So I think probably if I could do this over again, it would have been better for me to be a little bit more focused in terms of what's going on in, you know, in each of these different handlers. Because obviously there's a lot that changed. There was the move to this, the action or handler, that wasn't so much creating new things as it was just sort of moving them around. I did like sort of the logic behind the warning. So, you know, again, just divide the values by 8 so that you have the impression that there's sort of well, I mean, there is something overlaid on the screen, but kind of gives you it behaves in a way that would be consistent with what you'd expect from other programs. And then, yeah, when it comes time to do the save, it's just a simple save. So again, that is 2 hours of your life you won't get back if you watched to the end and you were expecting a big finale. But I think I will leave it there just to continue on with like I said, I think between now and the end, we're probably just going to do one part each day. But I don't really have any questions for myself from the tutorial. What I do have a question for myself on is, you know, clearly there's a bunch of material here for me to go through in terms of all of the different files. There's some formatting stuff, but then there's going to be some of these where I actually want to say, okay, so what's going on here, right? Like this doesn't seem to be just, you know, hey, don't do a print. Like in this case, open should be replaced by path open. Like some of these I actually do want to take the time and think about. I suppose it's a little too much to hope that I would get to problems 0. I suspect probably here I would need to get to problem 0, I would need to say, these are the following rules that I do not value in terms of the overall project. But for me, the reason why I have it set up like this is quite specifically to know what's coming up and to make decisions for myself. Yes, this is something that I care about, or this is something that I'm willing to go buy on. And again, maybe that's an extension that I can do, right? You know, I have, okay, here's the base tutorial as it is. Now I'm going to make some adjustments to follow the rules that come up in rough. And then maybe with whatever remaining time I have left, I'll think about implementing new things that I find exciting. Anyways, thank you everybody for hanging out. There should be another video for part 11 when let me just make sure I've got the schedule right. Yep, parts 10 and 11 on the week of the 13th. So I will try and get that done reasonably soon. And then the following week, we're done. So this means that I need to start, I definitely do need to start thinking about how I'm going to make this my own. Anyways, thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.